She carried 3 plates in one hand, a steady arc of ceramic and steam, while her left wrist was wrapped in thick white bandages, a ribbon of cotton that still trembled when she moved. The diner smelled like old coffee and fried onions, the air punctuated by the hiss of the grill and the steady clink of silverware. People at the counter glanced up, their conversations folding for a second around the site of the injury, an unspoken question hanging in the air. Why was she still working with that hand? Harold Whitman watched from his usual booth as he had for weeks, his voice a low hum to himself, not wanting to draw attention. He had owned the place for years, but had let it run under other hands while he kept a low profile. It made it easier to see what went on, to notice small things without the staff smoothing them out for visitors. Denise Carter had become hard to ignore. She moved through the narrow aisles between booths with a kind of quiet focus that made the diner feel steadier, even as the pain in her left wrist flared with every step. Harold felt a protective knot form in the back of his throat every time someone snapped at her or glanced away. If you like powerful, real lifestyle stories, subscribe for more. A young man at the counter muttered about how clumsy she was. A woman at a corner table kept watching with visible sympathy. Ross, the manager, stood near the register with his sleeves rolled up, a scowl trained at the servers, like a man polishing a set of rules that bent the world under his will. He was the sort who corrected tone instead of action, who wagged a finger in public and let resentment harden in private. With Denise, he was sharper than necessary, short words, tight eyes that looked for mistakes before they were made. Most people took that as a boss being a boss. Harold had watched it differently, not as discipline, but as a pattern, a slow pressure that squeezed and never released. Denise was not new to hard hours. She had a small apartment 2 towns over, a daughter in college, and a stack of overdue notices that breathed down her neck every month. She served the same faces because life had taught her that stability sometimes came in small shifts, the kind you did 1 plate at a time. In the mornings, she prepped eggs, wiped the counters until they shone, and at night she counted tips by the porch light and folded them into a wallet that rarely matched the number on the register. That disparity had been a source of quiet worry long before the bandages. Ross made a point of standing where customers could see him correct Denise. Not subtle, not private. It was theater designed to erode confidence, an intimidation that mistakes were more likely. People began to notice. Some called it efficiency, others called it cruelty. Denise kept her face even, smiled when she could, and swallowed the words she might have said.
There were bills, there were schedules, there was the simple, impossible arithmetic of doing what needed doing. Pain was another thing to translate into the language of endurance. The evening she had overheard the words that would change everything. She had been collecting to-go orders by the small office door. Ross had been on the phone, laughing too loud with someone on the other end. She'd paused, hand on the brass doorknob, thinking she should step back. This was none of her business. But one sentence snagged her like a hook. "Small cuts, nobody notices," Ross said. "Pin it on someone who can't fight back. Easier that way." Denise had nearly dropped the crate of cups. She stepped closer, eyes wide, and heard the conversation unravel. Ross talked about the register, about slipping money here and there, about arranging it so a name could be stuck on the pile if anyone dug into the numbers. He laughed at a phrase that should have been a warning. Not a moment later he found her, turning from the door, breath shallow with the rush of what she'd just heard. The confrontation happened too fast. One moment she had been confronting, a question on her lips. The next his hand was tight on her wrist, and she felt a pressure that buckled her breath. There was a sound that lived in her memory, a sharp twist, a snap of something that wasn't words. She collapsed to the floor for an instant and tasted metal from a chipped tooth where it had bitten into her mouth. Ross leaned over her like a shadow and hissed that she would be easier to frame now, with her hand useless, with the kind of sympathy that made people think she was clumsy or careless. "Stay quiet," he told her. "Stay and take it, or lose everything." She stayed. That was the small, terrible geometry of her choice. She wrapped her wrist as best she could, hiding the shape of the injury under a scarf, a bandage, a practiced smile. She kept working, because the bills would not wait for justice, and because there had been a threat that worked like frost. If she caused a scene, she might be fired, accused, and then left with the one thing keeping the household affixed. People who needed money often chose the safer harm. Harold had not known the details at first. He saw the bandage and the bruised smile, saw the way Denise's hands hesitated before she reached for the register drawer. He saw stacks of infractions on a tilted clipboard, every one bearing Denise's name. He noticed that the edge of the ledger on Ross's desk glinted in a way that suggested something more than ordinary bookkeeping. Scraps of receipts that didn't match up,
a pen that moved numbers without a witness. He began to collect what he could without making it obvious, the times when the till came up short, the sheets of employee responsibility forms that always seemed to blame the same person. It started as curiosity and hardened into suspicion.
Harold had been in enough rooms to know how small, careful cruelties metastasized into something larger. He watched the register totals after busy nights, comparing the expected cash with the sums on the front-of-house reports. The differences were small at first, a few dollars here, a $10 note missing from a midday rush, but they repeated like a pattern. He checked the schedule and found that Ross liked to lock the back office door at odd hours. He watched how he moved, where he placed certain staff members, who he left with longer tables, and who he singled out for public correction. The patterns formed a map. Harold didn't confront immediately. He was no hothead. He had lived long enough to know that accusations needed weight behind them. He made a point of learning the habits of the staff and the cadence of shifts. He started leaving his coat at the back, pretending to be an ordinary customer who preferred the late evening coffee when the kitchen slowed. He started to time his visits for the moments when Denise was finishing a double shift, when Ross's voice was more likely to be loud and unchecked. He collected his evidence the way a gardener collects seed, methodically, without drama. The first shard of proof came in the form of altered paperwork. One rainy Tuesday, Harold had lingered near the office under the pretense of asking about a takeaway menu. Ross answered the door with his usual clipped civility, but Harold slipped by him and saw the clipboard on the desk, a stack of performance complaints, each with the same apology scribbled in, and the same set of odd notations in the margins. On top of the pile, in Ross's own handwriting, was a list with neat dollar amounts that did not match the daily receipts. When Harold asked Ross casually about a missing number, Ross's eyes narrowed and he deflected with a story about suppliers. Harold filed the explanation away, like one puts an odd coin into a jar. A week later, Harold moved past suspicion into certainty. He had quietly watched the tiny accounts that control a small business, the tip jar, the daily drawer, the register tape. When some customers who always paid cash left their money and later asked for a receipt, the ledger told a different story. When the counts were compared to the credit card slips, the numbers twisted like a trail. Harold found discrepancies small enough to be plausible mistakes, frequent enough to look like intention. He began to look for corroboration he could hold up in daylight. Then, late one night, when the diner hummed softer and the light over the pie case cast long bands across the floor, Harold heard a voice he had been waiting for. He had a key, one that dated back to his ownership days, and he opened the office door quietly. Inside were the clipped noises of the register shift being closed and someone moving papers in a restless way. Ross was there, and with him another man, an acquaintance Harold had seen around, the kind of after-hours friend who traded favors for a cut. "You put her on the list yet?" the other man asked, voice low. "Done," Ross replied. "She won't make a fuss. Hands busted. No one suspects anything but herself. We'll write it off. They'll sign it. You know how it is." Harold heard the words as one hears an axe fall through a hidden root. He took a step that creaked on the floor. The sound was small, but enough. Ross turned as if he had been caught by a draft. The two men looked up, and in the room with its fluorescent hum, their faces shifted from schemer to something else. Surprised alarm, settling into a mask of anger. "You listening?" Ross said too loud, trying to hold the narrative in his voice. He gripped a stack of receipts like a talisman. "You're not a customer here." Harold didn't pretend. He closed the door behind him and pulled a folder from under his coat, placing it on the desk without flourish. He explained calmly that he had been watching the accounts, that he had noticed patterns, register shortages, odd entries in the expense book, complaints filed only when certain staff were on. He said the words that landed like stones in a still pond, that he had found evidence suggesting someone had been skimming, and that he had reason to believe employees were being set up to take the blame. Ross's face hardened into the face of a man caught making a calculation he had misjudged. He denied at first, fast and practiced, then tried to stall. Harold laid out the things he had found, photocopies of receipts that did not match the originals, daily cash counts that omitted particular bills, and an internal memo that had been altered to insert Denise's name into a history of infractions she did not remember. He explained he had recorded conversations, something Ross had not expected, where the aim was described plainly. The room shrank around Ross. He tried to accuse Harold of trespassing, of being paranoid, of imagining slights, but the evidence was a slow, patient thing that did not yield to bluster. Harold had a ledger with marked discrepancies, printouts of register tapes, a torn receipt with 2 handwriting samples, Ross's flourished script, and the scribble used to mark up the employee forms. He had nothing that would determine a court case in itself,
but he had enough to make the evening revolve. Harold insisted they do the right thing. He called the police. He did not threaten, he did not shout. He placed the phone on the desk and spoke to the dispatcher with a voice that made no judgment beyond what was necessary. 2 officers arrived within a short time, their uniforms folding into the front of the diner like a different kind of authority. They listened to Harold, took statements, and asked to speak to Denise. Ross tried a few things: denial, then indignation, then a clumsy attempt to turn the room against Harold by smearing the owner's motives.
He accused Harold of stirring trouble, of being a meddlesome proprietor who had the wrong idea about the realities of running a small business. Customers who had seen pieces of the story in recent weeks took sides. For a moment, the diner felt like a courtroom, everyone awaiting the juror's verdict in the form of badges and words. Denise came out from behind a counter, her apron still streaked with batter and a sheen of sweat on her brow. Her bandaged hand trembled, but her face was steady in a way that made Harold feel the weight lift from him, like air leaving a bag. She did not shout, she did not cry. She stood as curiosity swept the room, the murmurs falling into a hush that listened for the facts rather than gossiping about the shape of pain. The officers asked her to describe what had happened. She spoke slowly, measured and not theatrical, true to the woman who had kept her head down and her shoulders broad in the days before. She described the snippets she had heard, the way Ross had spoken about small cuts and pinning someone, her hand going white with fear at the memory of a twist that had sounded like a small breaking. She told them about the threats, about how Ross had warned her to keep quiet or face losing everything. An officer took her statement. Another began to look at the documents Harold had produced, the register tapes, the altered infractions, the photocopied receipts. They asked Ross questions. He shuffled papers and tried to smooth the ledger into something believable, but the men in uniform had a look of professionals who had seen this before, contempt that had hard edges but no drama. They compared handwriting, cross-checked timestamps, and listened for the pauses where lies will be telling. Ross's face shifted through shades of panic when he realized the officers had probable cause to make an arrest. He tried one last gambit, anger, an attempt to bluster his way through, but the law has a way of cutting through bluster with a simple standard: evidence of wrongdoing and intent. The officers read him his rights in that even, practiced cadence and placed plastic handcuffs around his wrists. The sound of the click that closed over skin was small, clinical, and in the diner it had the weight of a final bell. Customers rose from their seats in a cautious, unsure applause that soon turned into something more sincere. They had watched the man who scolded staff at the slightest glance walk out in handcuffs, and the diner's atmosphere shifted from a place of daily grind to one of public reckoning. People who had muttered criticism about Denise the week before now said sorry in ways that were awkward and human. A few regulars came up to her, palms out, in words that were short and full. Denise's relief was not theatrical. It was a slow release that made her shoulders droop like someone who had been holding their breath for too long. She hugged Harold briefly, a clumsy gesture that said more than any speech.
"Thank you," she said, voice thick but not broken. She did not say she was surprised. She had known there was rot in the corners of the place. She had not known anyone would step in to pry it open. The legal process had not been guaranteed by the simple act of arrest. Harold did not promise that there would be a conviction or a long-term sentence. He only promised what he had already done: discovered the truth, brought evidence to light, and let the proper channels take over. That was the boundary he had set for himself from the beginning. No vigilantism, only lawful response. The officers took statements, collected files, and led Ross out to the weighing cruiser that shone under the diner sign. In the weeks that followed, the diner shifted into a new normal. Denise's hours changed in ways that mattered: fewer double shifts, a schedule that acknowledged the healing her wrist needed. Harold had a word with the staff and with the remaining management. There would be oversight, a second set of eyes on the financials, and a new emphasis on fairness. He arranged for medical visits to be covered for Denise, and started a small fund among regulars to help with immediate expenses while courts moved at their own pace. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a practical set of measures to help a person who had been doing what she could to stay afloat. The community that had whispered turned into a chorus of support. Customers who once rolled their eyes at a scolding now tipped more generously. Regulars who had never seen themselves as activists in a small town found that the simplest action, showing up, speaking kindly, offering a seat, helped stitch a future that was kinder. People brought casseroles, dropped notes, left coffee on the counter with sticky-handed thank yous. It wasn't revolution, it was restoration, the kind that came in small, human increments. Denise was recognized quietly, without the spectacle sometimes reserved for heroes. Harold asked her if she wanted to move into a senior position at the diner. No flashy title, just stability, predictable hours, a raise that made the rent easier to manage.
She accepted, not because of headline-grabbing justice, but because it gave her room to breathe for the first time in months. Her promotion was a practical recognition of resilience, someone who had kept the place running through the gray hours, who had stayed when it would have been easier to leave, who had chosen to endure to keep her life together. The man who had watched from the booth returned to his seat with an evenness he hadn't realized he had lost. He no longer needed to watch for patterns with the same intensity. The immediate danger had been removed, and the diner hummed on like a small engine that had been tuned. He sipped his coffee, now thick and hot, and allowed himself a measure of satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with a simple restoration of balance. Denise would continue to heal.
She'd go to follow-up visits, check in with the officers when asked, and slowly learn that the world sometimes rearranged itself to let the truth breathe. She knew it would not erase the months that had been hard, nor the days when she had felt small under Ross's scorn. But the bandage on her wrist would one day come off, and there would be a scar, and a memory of a time she had been brave, in the quiet way many people are brave, by continuing to show up. People spoke afterward about Harold's decision to keep a low profile, about the way being an owner gives you power and the responsibility that comes with it. In small businesses, authority can be a shield or a blade. Harold chose to be a shield. He had been patient, deliberate, and careful to use the police and not his own fists. That steadiness kept the story from becoming about retribution and made it about the slow righting of a wrong. In the end, the diner resumed its rhythm. The grill hissed. A woman in a floral dress asked for eggs over easy. A man read the news in the corner. When Denise moved from table to table, arranging plates with the kind of practiced care that had always been hers, the regulars noticed something they hadn't before. The way she smiled now had a different softness. It had the shape of someone whose burden had been acknowledged and unmade in part by others. Harold folded the napkin on his lap and looked at the bandaged hand that would one day be healed, at the woman who had taught a room full of strangers the cost of assuming and the price of silence. He felt the story settled into the walls of the diner like a good memory, hard-earned, honest, and certain not to be forgotten. If this story moved you, share it and leave your thoughts below.